"No more intimacy between us," she stated, throwing her wedding ring across the kitchen table like it was some piece of worthless metal she'd found in a junk drawer. The ring bounced twice before settling next to the salt shaker, catching the overhead light in a way that made the small diamonds sparkle mockingly. I just walked through our front door after a 14-hour day pouring concrete foundations in the Florida heat, my work boots still caked with dried cement, and my wife Samantha was delivering what sounded like a verdict she'd spent all day rehearsing. I stood there in our kitchen doorway, lunch coolers still in my hand, watching her face for some sign that this was another one of her dramatic moments that would blow over by morning, but her expression was stone cold, almost satisfied, like she'd finally worked up the courage to say something she'd been thinking about for months. "I'm done pretending this marriage means anything to me," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "You're never here, you're emotionally unavailable when you are here, and I'm tired of feeling like I'm married to a ghost who pays the bills." The accusation hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire, and I realized this wasn't about tonight or even this week. This was about something that had been building inside her while I'd been focused on providing for us, working overtime to save for the house she wanted, the vacation she'd been planning, the financial security she said mattered to her. I set my cooler down slowly and walked to the table, picking up the ring with the same careful precision I used when handling delicate electrical work on job sites, examining it for a moment before placing it gently beside her dinner plate instead of trying to force it back onto her finger. "Okay," I said, my voice calmer than I felt, "if that's what you want." The word, "okay," seemed to deflate something in her posture, like she'd been bracing for a fight that wasn't coming, and for the first time since I'd walked in, uncertainty flickered across her face. She'd expected me to beg, to promise to change, to fight for us with the same intensity one brought to every construction project, but instead I was treating her declaration like a work order that needed to be acknowledged and filed away. "That's it?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "You're not going to say anything else?" I looked at her sitting there in the dining chair we'd bought together 3 years ago, her real estate blazer still perfectly pressed despite it being almost 9 at night, her makeup still flawless, and I realized I was looking at someone who had already checked out of our marriage emotionally but wanted me to be the one to fight for something she'd already decided wasn't worth saving. "What do you want me to say, Samantha? You just told me intimacy between us is over and threw your wedding ring away. Sounds like you've made your decision." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of our refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the main road, and I could see her calculating whether this calm acceptance was some kind of strategy or if I really was just going to let her walk away without a fight. I woke up the next morning at 5:15, 15 minutes before my usual alarm, with a clarity that surprised me, like someone had cleaned a dirty window I'd been looking through for months without realizing how clouded my vision had become. The Florida sunrise was just beginning to filter through our bedroom blinds, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors we'd installed together during our first year of marriage when we still talked about building something permanent together. Samantha's declaration hadn't been spontaneous. It was the culmination of months of eye rolls when I talked about my latest construction project, sighs when I came home tired from managing crews and dealing with contractors, and that particular way she'd started looking at me like I was a disappointment she'd learned to tolerate rather than a partner she'd chosen to build a life with. I'd been working 60-hour weeks trying to build the life she said she wanted, putting in overtime on commercial projects that paid double time, saving every extra dollar for the future she claimed to be excited about, but somewhere along the way, she decided that my efforts weren't good enough and that I wasn't good enough. And last night she'd finally worked up the courage to say it out loud with the kind of cold finality that left no room for negotiation or compromise. Instead of spending my energy trying to convince someone who clearly didn't want to be convinced, someone who had already made up her mind about my value as a husband and partner, I decided to invest it in becoming the man I wanted to be, with or without her approval, with or without her presence in my life as anything more than a legal arrangement that needed to be unwound properly. That evening, instead of coming home to another silent dinner punctuated by passive-aggressive comments about my late arrival and lack of emotional availability, I drove straight to Tampa Bay Community College and enrolled in their evening business management program, something I'd been putting off for 3 years because Samantha always had some social event or dinner plan that took priority over my professional development. "I want to learn how to run my own construction company," I told the admissions counselor, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Rodriguez who seemed genuinely excited about my goals and asked thoughtful questions about my experience in the industry. "I've been working for other people long enough," making them wealthy while I stay in the same position year after year. The application process took 2 hours, involving placement tests, financial aid paperwork, and course selection meetings that felt more productive than any conversation I'd had with my wife in months. And when I finally got home at almost 10:30, Samantha was waiting in our living room with her arms crossed and that expression she wore when she was preparing to lecture me about my failures as a husband. "Where were you tonight?" she demanded, her voice sharp with the kind of accusatory tone she usually reserved for discussing my work schedule. "I made dinner and you never came home, never called, never texted, never bothered to let me know you had other plans." I hung my keys on the hook by the door, next to the small mirror where she checked her appearance every morning before leaving for real estate appointments, and looked at her sitting there in her silk pajamas, perfectly put together even at bedtime, every blonde hair in place despite having been home alone all evening, and realized that for the first time in months, I genuinely didn't care whether she was upset with me or not. "I enrolled in night school," I said simply, setting my leather portfolio on the kitchen counter next to the course catalog and enrollment paperwork that represented the beginning of something bigger than either of us had imagined. "Classes start Monday and run 3 nights a week for the next 18 months. The confusion on her face was almost comical, like I'd announced I was joining the circus or becoming a professional wrestler, her green eyes widening as she tried to process this information against the backdrop of what she'd expected my reaction to her ultimatum to be. "Night school? What kind of night school? Why didn't you discuss this with me first?" Her tone suggested that continuing education was somehow beneath us, even though she'd spent the last year complaining that I lacked ambition and vision for anything beyond my current paycheck. "Business management, accounting, project planning, everything I need to know to run my own construction company instead of making other people rich with my labor." I walked past her toward the bedroom, treating this conversation like a brief status update between roommates rather than the emotional confrontation she was clearly hoping for, the kind of dramatic scene where she could reassert control over my decisions and my future. "Tyler, we need to talk about last night," she called after me, but I was already closing the bathroom door, ready to shower off the day and start preparing for a future that might or might not include her input, advice, or approval. Within 2 weeks, I had completely restructured my entire daily routine in ways that would have seemed impossible when I was still trying to accommodate Samantha's expectations and social calendar. I started waking up at 5:30 instead of 6:15, hitting the new gym that had opened near the construction site for an hour of weight training before work, something that gave me energy instead of draining it and helped me process the stress of both my marriage and my career ambitions. My evenings were now dedicated to classes at the community college, business law on Mondays, accounting fundamentals on Wednesdays, and project management on Fridays, which meant I wasn't getting home until after 9 most nights, eliminating the awkward dinner conversations where Samantha would pick apart my day or complain about her real estate clients. Weekends became opportunities for professional development seminars and networking events that I discovered through my classmates, guys who were also trying to build something bigger than just a paycheck. And for the first time in years, I found myself surrounded by people who talked about goals and strategies instead of gossip and complaints. "You should come to this real estate investment workshop Saturday," suggested Marcus, a fellow student who ran a small plumbing business. "They're covering commercial property analysis and it might be useful for your construction company plans." I started spending Saturday mornings at these seminars held in hotel conference rooms around Tampa, taking notes on business financing, market analysis, and strategic planning while drinking coffee that didn't taste like disappointment and listening to speakers who treated entrepreneurship like an achievable goal rather than an impossible dream. My coworkers began noticing the changes almost immediately. I was more focused during the day, asking better questions about project timelines and profit margins, and suggesting efficiency improvements that caught the attention of our site supervisor, Danny Rodriguez. "Tyler, you've been different lately," Danny mentioned during our lunch break on a Thursday, "more engaged, asking smarter questions about the business side of things, and your work quality has gone up even though you're obviously tired." The observation led to a conversation about my night school program and business goals, which resulted in Danny recommending me for a promotion to senior foreman position, a role that came with project oversight responsibilities and a 15% salary increase. Meanwhile, I stopped coming home for lunch, choosing instead to eat with my crew and discuss construction techniques or review my class notes, and I stopped sending Samantha those little update texts throughout the day that she'd never responded to anyway. Our shared living space began to feel like a temporary arrangement between roommates who happened to be legally married. with me treating our interactions like polite but distant exchanges between people whose lives were moving in different directions. I moved my alarm clock to the guest bathroom so my early morning routine wouldn't wake her, started doing my own laundry on Sunday mornings while she slept in, and began keeping my school materials and business planning notebooks in a small office area I'd set up in what used to be our craft room. "You're never here anymore," she complained one evening when I came home from a particularly engaging class on small business taxation, but her tone suggested annoyance rather than genuine longing, like she was upset about losing control over my schedule rather than missing my actual presence. What Samantha had initially viewed as her victory, finally pushing me away from our marriage without having to be the one who filed for divorce, quickly transformed into something that clearly made her uncomfortable in ways she hadn't anticipated. For the first week after her dramatic declaration, she'd seemed almost smug, walking around our house with this satisfied expression like she'd finally put me in my place and established the power dynamic she wanted, but by the second week, I could see confusion creeping into her eyes when I didn't beg for another chance or promise to change my work schedule to prioritize her needs. She started hovering around me when I was home, making comments about my new gym routine and asking pointed questions about my evening classes, not because she was interested in my personal growth but because my complete emotional detachment was clearly unsettling her control over the situation. "Who are these classmates you're always studying with?" she asked one evening while I was reviewing notes for an upcoming exam on business contracts, her tone casual but her eyes sharp with suspicion. "Just people from class," I replied without looking up from my textbook. "We're working on a group project about construction industry market analysis." The mention of other people, especially when she couldn't monitor or control those relationships, seemed to trigger something in her that I'd never seen before, a kind of territorial anxiety that was completely at odds with someone who had declared our intimacy over just 3 weeks earlier. When our mutual friend Lisa mentioned seeing me at a networking event at the Marriott downtown, looking really confident and engaged, during a panel discussion about small business financing, Samantha's reaction was immediate and telling. "Tyler was at the Marriott? Who else was there?" The questions came rapid fire, like she was conducting an investigation rather than making casual conversation, and I realized that my apparent happiness and success outside our marriage was threatening her narrative about my inadequacies as a husband and partner. She started checking my social media obsessively, something I only discovered because she accidentally liked a photo from 2 months ago while scrolling through my timeline, and when she found pictures from a real estate investment seminar where I was engaged in animated conversations with other attendees, including several professional women in business attire, her mood shifted into something I could only describe as barely controlled panic. "I didn't know you were interested in real estate," she said, her voice tight with forced casualness. "Maybe I could help you with that since it's my field." The offer to suddenly become supportive of my goals, after months of dismissing my ambitions as unrealistic, revealed just how much my independence was disrupting her expectations about how our separation was supposed to unfold. She'd expected me to be devastated, to come crawling back with promises to be a better husband, to beg her to reconsider her decision about our marriage, but instead I was thriving in ways that made her question whether she'd miscalculated the entire situation. Samantha's attempts to regain control over our relationship became increasingly desperate and transparent as the weeks progressed, starting with small gestures that felt calculated rather than genuine. She began cooking elaborate dinners on nights when she knew I'd be home from class, meals that required hours of preparation and featured all my supposed favorite foods, then acting hurt when I'd politely eat a small portion before retreating to my study area to work on assignments. "I made your favorite lasagna," she'd announce with the kind of expectant smile that demanded gratitude and emotional connection, but when I simply thanked her and continued reading my textbook on construction project management, her expression would shift to confusion and barely concealed frustration. She started wearing outfits around the house that were clearly designed to get my attention: low-cut tops, short skirts, the kind of clothing she used to reserve for date nights, and would find excuses to walk past my makeshift office area while I was studying, but my focus remained entirely on my coursework and business planning. "I ran into Derek at Publix yesterday," she mentioned casually one evening, referring to her ex-boyfriend from college who she'd always claimed was still interested in her. "He asked about you, said he'd heard we were having some problems." The obvious attempt to spark jealousy fell completely flat because I was genuinely too focused on my own goals to care about her strategic conversations with former boyfriends, and I simply nodded without looking up from my notes on small business tax regulations. Her escalation reached almost comedic levels when she staged what appeared to be a minor kitchen accident, claiming she'd hurt her wrist while reaching for something in a high cabinet, complete with tears and dramatic wincing that seemed designed to trigger my protective instincts. I calmly assessed the situation, determined that she needed medical attention for what might be a sprain, and drove her to the urgent care clinic without providing the emotional drama and concerned fussing she was clearly hoping for. "You're so calm about everything now," she complained during the drive, her voice carrying a note of genuine bewilderment. "It's like you don't care about anything anymore." The truth was that I cared deeply about many things: my education, my career goals, my personal growth, my future business plans, but I no longer cared about managing her emotions or walking on eggshells to avoid her disapproval, which apparently felt like indifference to someone who was used to being the center of my attention. When she attempted to initiate physical intimacy one evening, approaching me with the kind of seductive confidence that had once been irresistible, I gently but firmly reminded her of her own declaration about our relationship being over. "You said intimacy between us was finished," I told her, my voice kind but unwavering. "I'm just respecting the boundaries you established." The rejection clearly stunned her, not because she genuinely wanted to be intimate, but because she'd expected her physical appeal to override my rational response to her own stated preferences about our marriage. After 6 weeks of failed manipulation tactics, Samantha finally reached her breaking point on a Thursday evening when I came home from a particularly successful class presentation about construction industry profit margins. I found her sitting on our living room floor, sobbing with a kind of raw desperation that seemed genuine for the first time since this whole situation began, her perfectly styled hair disheveled and her makeup streaked down her cheeks in ways that suggested hours of crying rather than a strategic emotional display. "Tyler, please, we need to talk," she said through tears. "I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend like this is what I wanted." I sat down across from her, maintaining some distance while she launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about how she'd been testing our relationship, seeing if I really loved her enough to fight for us, and how my calm acceptance had proven that I didn't care about saving our marriage. "I didn't really mean it when I said intimacy was over," she sobbed. "I was just upset about you working so much. I felt like you didn't prioritize me anymore, and I wanted to see if you'd choose me over your job." The manipulation was so transparent that I almost felt embarrassed for her, but I listened without interrupting as she cycled through every excuse she could think of for her behavior. When tears and explanations didn't produce the response she wanted, she shifted to threats, claiming she would hurt herself if I left her, that she couldn't survive without me, that our divorce would destroy her emotionally and financially since she'd become dependent on my income and stability. "I'll change everything about myself," she promised desperately. "I'll quit my real estate job and focus completely on being the wife you need. I'll support your business goals. I'll never complain about your work schedule again." The offers kept escalating until she was essentially promising to become a completely different person, which only reinforced my conviction that she'd never actually loved or respected who I really was. "Samantha," I said quietly, "desperation isn't the same as love, and panic isn't the same as respect. You're not sorry about what you said, you're sorry about how I responded to it." When individual manipulation failed, she enlisted our mutual friends to intervene on her behalf, telling them carefully edited versions of our situation that painted me as cold and unforgiving for not accepting her apology and giving our marriage another chance. "Tyler," Lisa called me, "my buddy Mark said after work one day. She said Samantha's really struggling and that maybe you're being a little harsh about this whole thing." I calmly explained to Mark, and later to anyone else who brought it up, that I was simply honoring the boundaries Samantha herself had established when she declared our intimacy over and threw away her wedding ring, and that I wasn't interested in being in a relationship with someone who used emotional manipulation and threats of self-harm to control my behavior. 2 months after Samantha's initial declaration, I suggested we meet at Romano's Italian restaurant for what I knew would be our final conversation as a married couple, choosing the same place where we'd had our first date 3 years earlier because the sentimental location might help her understand the finality of what was happening and give her some closure for a relationship that had died long before either of us was willing to admit it. The restaurant held memories of better times when we talked about our dreams and plans for the future, when she'd seemed genuinely interested in my goals and I'd believed we were building something together rather than participating in some elaborate performance where she played the role of supportive girlfriend while privately deciding whether I was worth keeping long-term. She arrived 20 minutes early, wearing the blue dress I'd once told her looked beautiful on her, the one with small white flowers that she'd worn to her company Christmas party where she'd introduced me to her colleagues as her serious boyfriend who worked in construction, her hair and makeup perfect in that effortless way that had originally attracted me when we'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue. I could see hope flickering in her green eyes as she assumed the meaningful location indicated my willingness to reconcile and start over, to forgive her dramatic declaration and return to the comfortable routine of marriage where she could take my devotion for granted while complaining about my inadequacies. "Tyler, I'm so glad you chose this place," she said as I sat down across from her in the booth where we'd shared our first awkward conversation about our careers and life goals. "It feels like a sign that we can get back to where we started, back to being happy together like we were in the beginning when everything felt so promising." I ordered a coffee while she ordered the same chicken parmesan she'd gotten on our first date, clearly trying to recreate some kind of romantic atmosphere that would remind me of better times, but my purpose for this meeting was entirely different from what she was imagining in her hopeful fantasy about reconciliation and second chances. "Samantha, I asked you here because I wanted to tell you in person that I've signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in Westchase and filed the preliminary paperwork for legal separation," I said calmly, watching her face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally panic as my words registered and shattered whatever scenario she'd constructed in her mind about this dinner. "I've already moved most of my belongings, my school materials, and my gym equipment, and I'll be completely moved out of our house by Sunday evening." The fork fell from her manicured hand and clattered against her plate as she stared at me like I'd announced something impossible, her carefully constructed composure crumbling in real time as the reality of permanent separation hit her harder than any emotional manipulation tactics she tried over the past 2 months. "But I thought we were going to work things out," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's background noise. "I thought this dinner meant you were ready to forgive me and try again, to give our marriage another chance now that I understand how much I hurt you." I explained that our marriage had been over the moment she threw her ring across the table and declared our intimacy finished, that her recent desperate attempts to reconcile weren't based on love or respect but on panic about losing her financial security and social status as a married woman who didn't have to worry about supporting herself completely. "I'm not angry with you, Samantha," I said honestly, keeping my voice gentle despite the finality of what I was saying, "but I can't build a future with someone who fundamentally doesn't respect who I am or what I bring to a relationship, someone who sees marriage as a game where she can push boundaries and test limits without facing real consequences." When she began begging me to reconsider, promising once again to become the perfect wife she should have been from the beginning, to support my goals instead of questioning them, to appreciate my work ethic instead of resenting it, I simply placed a $20 bill on the table to cover my untouched coffee and the tip for our patient waitress who'd been watching this uncomfortable scene unfold. "Stop, wait, I'm just upset. Come back, I want you," she called out desperately as I walked toward the restaurant exit, her voice carrying across the dining room in a way that made other customers turn to stare at what was clearly a relationship ending in real time, but I didn't stop or turn around because I'd already given her every chance to value what we had while she had it. I paused at the door and looked back at her one final time, seeing not the confident woman I'd married but someone who had finally realized the consequences of treating marriage like a game she could control through manipulation and emotional blackmail, someone who had pushed away a man who would have done anything for her because she'd mistaken his dedication for weakness and his love for desperation. "Too late, Samantha," I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough for her to hear but not loud enough to create more of a scene than she'd already made. "Respect doesn't come with an expiration date that you can reset whenever it's convenient for you, and neither does love."